They called her a discount program nurse before she even clocked in. Dr. Ashford had made that clear to the 3 residents circling him like sharks that morning, a comment about cutting corners on hiring and where are the credentials. She didn't hear it. She was already 2 floors down, standing in the locker room of Seattle General in Norfolk, staring at her new badge. Kate Rodriguez, RN. Just those letters. Just those initials. The name underneath the badge, Katie, was real enough. The major part stayed buried, along with everything that came before. 5 years since Bagram. 5 years since the IED that shattered her hip in 3 places and ended everything. 5 years since the discharge papers, the medical board hearing, the decision that a surgeon with a limp couldn't lead combat operations anymore. The army had been right. The hip had never healed perfectly. The tremor in her hands came and went, some days barely noticeable, other days betraying her the moment she reached for anything smaller than a bedpan. But the army had been wrong about one thing: it hadn't ended her ability to save lives. It had just moved the battlefield from forward operating bases to fluorescent hallways that hummed like aircraft engines. She clipped the badge to her scrubs, starch crisp, hospital white, all illusion and fresh starts, and touched the chain around her neck through the fabric. One dog tag. David's tag. The metal was warm from her skin, and she pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling it there like a promise she'd made and kept every single day since the letter arrived. The letter that came in an envelope with no return address, just Marcus Hayes's handwriting on the outside. Marcus Hayes. Sergeant. The man who'd written to say he was sorry, that he'd done everything he could, that her son had died saving 3 of his men, and could she ever forgive him? She would never forgive him. But she could work the same hospital where he recovered. She could learn to move past him in corridors without flinching. She could pretend that the universe wasn't playing chess with her life. The locker door slammed. The sound echoed in the empty room like a shot fired in a canyon. She stood there for 2 seconds, just long enough to feel the muscle memory activate, the combat reflex that made her scan for exits and threats. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of old bone. The smell hit her first, antiseptic layered over something underneath, something organic and industrial, the scent of a place where bodies were repaired and sometimes couldn't be. She'd smelled worse. Forward operating bases reeked of diesel and blood and fear. This was cleaner. This was just medicine. Medical surgical floor assignment. Unit 3. She'd studied the layout 3 times during her orientation week, committing it to memory the way she'd memorized FOB perimeter maps, exits, supply closets, equipment locations, sight lines. The nurses' station was a chaos of monitors and charts, 3 nurses moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd never had time to waste. One of them, dark hair, early 40s, eyes that had seen too much, looked up as Katie approached. "First shift?" the woman asked. "Yes," Katie said. Them came automatic. Service ran deeper than 3 months of civilian life. The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Diane. Don't call me. We have a full census today, and Dr. Ashford is already making rounds with some board members visiting from the corporate office. He's the type who counts every minute you're not directly in front of a patient. Stay visible, document everything, and if he asks you to do something, move fast and smile about it. He hates the smile, but it matters more that you move fast." "Understood," Katie said, and Diane handed her a tablet with patient assignments. Room 312. Room 315. Room 317. Room 314, Sergeant Marcus Hayes, post-surgical recovery, mobility assistance required, current status stable but isolated. She stared at that line for a half-second too long. The tablet felt heavier than it should have been. "You okay?" Diane was watching her now. "Yes. Fine. Thank you. You're limping." "Hip injury." "Military," Katie said, keeping her voice flat. She'd rehearsed that answer. "Matter of fact." "Closed door." Don't invite follow-up questions. Diane nodded without prying. That was good. That was the kind of person the hospital needed more of. Katie moved through the hallway toward the patient rooms, her left hip tight, each step a small negotiation with cartilage that had been welded back together with titanium and prayer. The tremor in her right hand was minimal today. She made fists and released them twice, felt the steadiness return. Her hands had held people together, actually held them, bones and organs and the slippery architecture of human survival, through sandstorms and power failures and mortar rounds landing 300 meters away. They could handle a bedpan. They could handle anything. The intercom crackled, Dr. Ashford to Unit 3. Dr. Ashford to Unit 3. His voice came across clipped and irritated, the kind of voice that didn't like repeating itself. She could hear him before she saw him moving through the hallway with the kind of authority that made the air pressure change. She was pulling vitals on room 312 when he appeared in her peripheral vision, tall, expensive suit despite being at a hospital, silver hair like polished titanium, jaw set like he was constantly disappointed by everything around him. He had 3 residents trailing him and 2 people in business casual that screamed corporate oversight. He was already talking, never breaking stride. Response time in this unit is unacceptable. The ICU is showing a 4.3-minute average from call to arrival. I need to show our board members that we can match that efficiency across all departments. That means pulling staff from less critical floors. The MedSurg unit can operate lean. Patients here are stable, post-operative, recovery protocols are established. The ICU needs boots on the ground for immediate interventions. One of the residents, young, nervous energy radiating off him like heat, spoke up. But Dr. Ashford, the medical surgical patients are exactly why we have protocols. Ashford cut him off. And protocols don't require a full-staffed unit. Adjust assignments. Pull 2 nurses from MedSurg, reassign to ICU. Tell them it's temporary. Tell them it's for the hospital's benefit. Whatever language helps them accept a pay cut for the week. The board members nodded. Ashford didn't look at Katie, but she knew he'd seen her. She could feel the weight of his dismissal like a physical thing, a glance that catalogued her and filed her under not worth noting. The slight limp. The subtle tremor in her hands. The discount program scrubs from a new grad with no apparent connections, no recommendation letters, just an application that came through the online system without anyone important vouching for her. He was already turning away, his entourage trailing him like a comet's tail. Katie stood in the doorway of room 312, watching a woman 72 years old sleep fitfully after a thyroidectomy, and she let the moment pass. The moment where she could have made herself visible. The moment where competence might have registered. She'd learned something in 5 years of rebuilding. Sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding it all together. But she hadn't learned it from nursing school. She'd learned it from a combat surgeon named Major Katie Rodriguez, who'd kept screaming soldiers alive by being the last calm thing in a room full of panic. Who'd made decisions with shrapnel in her field pack and blood under her fingernails and done it all without announcing it, without needing anyone to see. The hand tremor had come later, after the explosion, after the IED that transformed 3 ribs and a hip into a reconstruction project and a medical discharge. The hand tremor was her body's way of keeping score. The nurse shortage on Unit 3 happened between 10 a.m. and noon. Diane and one other nurse, a man named Robert who moved like he carried the weight of 30 years, suddenly had to stretch across a floor that needed 4 people. Patients waited for call bells. Medications were flagged for delayed delivery. The rhythm of the unit broke like a transmission grinding down. Katie stayed in motion, moving between rooms with mechanical efficiency, her body remembering how to triage, how to prioritize, how to be everywhere at once on a battlefield where the only weapons were protocol and medication and the simple act of showing up when someone was frightened and alone. She passed room 314 twice in the first hour. The door was closed both times. She didn't look inside. By 2 p.m., when the board members left and Dr. Ashford retreated to whatever office housed people with his kind of authority, the damage was already calculated. 3 patients had waited over an hour for pain medication. One post-operative patient had developed a fever that might have been monitored earlier. And Sergeant Marcus Hayes, wheelchair-bound, combat wounded, recovering from a procedure that had taken 3 hours and would take months of rehabilitation, sat in a room that nobody was checking on. Katie knew this because she'd reviewed the chart. Not because she was assigned to him. Because protocols were protocols, and room 314 had exactly 0 vitals recorded since 10:36 a.m. That wasn't a request to check on him. It was a command delivered by the part of her that had made it through 5 years without flinching. And she would follow it. Just not yet. Not while anyone was watching. True class was what you did when the lights went out, when nobody was there to see it, when the only person you had to answer to was yourself and the uniform you wore, even if the uniform now was a hospital badge with a civilian name and hands that couldn't always stop trembling. The fluorescent lights hummed above room 314, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Katie pushed the supply cart through the doorway at exactly 1,400 hours, her shift notes clutched against her chest, and stopped. The smell hit her first, not the clinical antiseptic that should have defined Seattle General's corridors, but something acrid and human. Something abandoned. Sergeant Marcus Hayes sat in his wheelchair beside the window, his hospital gown soaked through, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he'd given up on dignity hours ago. His call button lay on the floor 6 feet away, a yellow plastic rectangle that might as well have been on another continent. Katie's eyes traced the timeline, the gown darkened at the collar, the moisture pooling beneath him in the wheelchair seat, the way his skin had taken on that particular grayness that came from lying still too long in your own waste. She didn't move. Didn't react. She had seen worse in Bagram, had held worse, had made peace with worse. The composure came first, always first. One breath through her nose. One through her mouth. Then she stepped inside and closed the door. How long? She asked the charge nurse who'd been standing behind her, clipboard in hand. The older woman, Nancy, 2 decades in that unit, glanced at the clock on the wall. Since 0600. Dr. Ashford reassigned the floor staff to ICU for the board tour. Visiting administrators, big money moment. Said the critical patients needed priority. Nancy's voice carried the specific exhaustion of someone who'd watched protocols break before and knew no one would answer for it. Marcus kept pressing the call button until he stopped. Around 0800. Katie nodded once. I'll handle it. Nancy left. Katie locked the door. She moved with the fluid precision of someone whose hands had forgotten how to panic, had trained themselves into muscle memory that predated civilian life by a decade. Warm water. Gentle pressure. A washcloth that felt like trust. She cleaned Sergeant Hayes's shoulders first, then his arms, working methodically, speaking in a voice that carried no judgment, no pity, just the flat competence of someone doing a job that needed doing. As she cleaned his forearms, she saw it, a tattoo on his left arm, faded but unmistakable. The outline of Bagram Air Base, the mountain peaks rendered in black ink, the call sign a black horse scripted beneath. Her breath caught, a single moment of disruption she swallowed immediately. She'd been at Bagram. She knew that mountain. She knew that unit. Her hands kept moving. Black horse, she asked quietly, working the washcloth along the inside of his wrist. Marcus's eyes, which had been unfocused moments before, sharpened. Yeah. 2nd Battalion. Long time ago. His voice was gravel and resignation, the sound of a man who'd stopped expecting people to remember. Good unit, Katie said. It wasn't a question. She finished cleaning him in silence. Fresh gown. Clean sheets, changed with the efficiency of someone who'd made 1,000 field beds in desert heat with nothing but bottled water and discipline. By 14:30, Sergeant Marcus Hayes was restored to some semblance of dignity, and Katie had documented everything in his chart, admitted 0600. No checked vitals. No recorded bathroom assistance. No documented care. Found incontinent. Full body wash. Gown change. Vitals stable. Recommend Q2H checks moving forward. She timestamped the entry and added her signature in clean block letters, K. Rodriguez, RN. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Ashford entered the room with the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Behind him came Marcus's adult son, David Jr., tall and wide-shouldered, with his father's jawline and something harder in his eyes, the look of a man who'd learned to watch doctors and find them wanting. The family resemblance sat between them like an accusation. Ashford's eyes landed on Katie first. "What are you doing in here?" This patient was scheduled for reassessment at 1500. Katie straightened. One measured breath. Her voice came out level, administrative, nothing underneath it but fact. Sergeant Hayes was incontinent. No documented care since 0600. I provided hygiene assistance and documentation per protocol. She watched his face flush. Watched the vein in his temple darken like a warning light. He turned to David Jr., the gesture theatrical, designed for audience approval. "This is exactly why we don't hire these discount nursing programs, no sense of protocol, no documentation, just playing hero." He said it like she wasn't in the room. Like she was a mistake that could be corrected with volume. "I have standing orders about non-critical patients. When the board visits, we allocate resources to the units that matter. This is basic hospital administration." A single tear escaped Katie's eye. She felt it before she saw it, that involuntary betrayal of the body, the thing that happened when something inside you recognized itself in a story you'd never told anyone. She reached up and wiped it away with the back of her hand, maintained eye contact, and said nothing. The silence was a weapon. David Jr. stared at his father in the bed. Then at Ashford. Then at Katie. And something shifted in his expression, a recalibration, the moment when a face tells you that you've been wrong about something fundamental. Ashford waited for more. When it didn't come, he filled the space with authority that was beginning to feel thin. "The chart needs to reflect the care plan I established. Your personal additions are," he paused, searching for language that would sound professional instead of threatened. "Your interpretation of protocol is noted. Don't let it happen again." Katie's jaw tightened slightly. "The documentation is time-stamped, doctor. Dated and entered per hospital record standards." He left. David Jr. lingered for a moment longer, looking between his father and the nurse who'd cleaned him, and then he followed. The next day, Katie sat alone in the break room with a container of leftovers that tasted like nothing. 3 nurses came in, grabbed their lunches from the refrigerator, saw her sitting by the window, and exchanged the kind of glance that communicated entire conversations. They left without speaking. She finished eating in the fluorescent buzz, the hum of the refrigerator a metronome counting down something she already knew was coming. By Friday, the written reprimand appeared on the unit board where everyone would see it. Posted in the break room like a public notice of failure. Insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Typed in official letterhead. Signed by Dr. Ashford and countersigned by HR. Katie read it once. Folded it twice. Returned it to the board without comment and went back to her rounds. She was pushing the medication cart toward room 312 when Marcus's call button lit up on the nurse station monitor. No one moved. The unit had 42 beds and 2 nurses. The call button kept blinking. Katie continued toward room 312, administered the cardiac medication to Mrs. Chen, checked her blood pressure, consistent, stable, within range, and then she dated. 2 minutes of her break. One patient who needed something simple. A water pitcher refilled. A pillow adjusted. She didn't stay long enough for anyone to notice. But that night, something changed. Katie clocked out at 1900 but didn't leave. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching the rain accumulate on the windshield, then she came back inside through the emergency entrance and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. The night shift was minimal, 1 nurse covering 20 beds, the kind of understaffing that killed people on paper but somehow continued anyway because hospitals ran on the assumption that nobody would actually need help. She slipped into room 314. Marcus was awake, staring at the wall. His son was gone. The room was quiet except for the ventilator's steady rhythm and the heart monitor's electronic pulse. Katie pulled a chair up and sat beside the bed without speaking. She didn't know why. Protocol said she shouldn't be here. Her reprimand said she shouldn't be here. But something in her recognized something in him, not as a patient, but as something older. Something that understood the particular exhaustion of surviving something no one else believed had destroyed you. You served, he said. Not a question. No, Katie said. Just in the reserves. Administrative, mostly. She was a good liar. She'd had practice. She kept her hands in her lap and her face toward the window, and she stayed until 2200, when she stood and left without saying goodbye. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it started a countdown she didn't yet know was running. The nights changed Katie. Not the long ones, the quiet ones. After her shift ended at 1900, after the day nurses clocked out and the evening staff settled into their routines, she would find herself walking past room 314 instead of toward the exit. The hospital at 8 o'clock had a different rhythm. Slower. More honest. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant hum, and the hallway smelled like the ghost of antiseptic and something older, the scent of people waiting for news that would never come. Marcus Hayes lay in that room like a man who had learned to disappear into his own body. The wheelchair beside his bed had become a monument to mobility he no longer possessed. Katie would pull a chair close to his bedside and sit without speaking, her scrub still damp from the shift, her hands folded in her lap. She never turned on the overhead light. Just the pale glow from the monitors, the steady green blip of his heart, the oxygen saturation climbing and falling like breath itself. At first, he didn't acknowledge her. By the third night, he did. You don't have to stay, Marcus said. His voice was rough from disuse, the kind of rasp that comes from a throat that has forgotten how to carry weight. I'm not your patient anymore. Katie didn't move. Neither am I your responsibility. He almost smiled. Almost. That's not how it works, is it? By the second week, Marcus was waiting for her. She would round the corner near the supply room and see him watching the door, his body angled in that patient's way, head tilted, eyes tracking movement like a hunter who had learned patience in the mountains. On a Wednesday night, as rain hammered against the window like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch, Marcus told her. Bagram, 2009. You knew my unit. It wasn't a question. Katie's hand stilled. The rain kept falling. 2nd Battalion. I commanded it. We lost people that year. He turned his head toward the window. Lost a kid from Texas. 19 years old. David Rodriguez. Best medic I ever saw, and I've seen a lot. The room didn't move. The monitors kept their rhythm. Katie's breath came level and measured, the way she had been trained to breathe when incoming fire was theoretical rather than actual. The letter, Marcus continued, went to his mother. She was the primary emergency contact. I wrote it myself, 3 pages, single-spaced. Told her what he did, what he meant, that he saved 14 Marines that day before the IED got him. He turned to look at her directly. His eyes were the color of old concrete. I never knew if she got it. If it mattered. If anything I wrote made it better. Katie stood. Walked to the window. Outside, Norfolk twisted in the rain like something trying to shed its own skin. Her reflection in the glass was a stranger, hollow-eyed, steady-jawed, a woman constructed from parts that didn't quite fit together anymore. The dog tag under her scrubs felt heavier than it ever had. She got it, Katie said. Her voice came out like gravel. It was all she had. For a long time, it was all that was left. Silence pooled between them, deep and deliberate. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed, carried the weight of recognition. What's your name? Your real name. Katie turned back to face him. Does it matter? Yes. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the chair closer and sat, and they stayed that way until visiting hours officially ended, two people separated by rank and time and the terrible clarity of shared loss, held together by a single dog tag and the knowledge that some bonds don't break, they just go quiet for a while. The night of the crisis came on a Friday, unremarkable except for its consequences. Katie had worked her shift and stayed past dinner, as had become habit. Marcus was asleep, his face relaxed in the particular vulnerability of sedation, his oxygen sat reading 93%. She was reading the chart, his medications, his latest lab work, the notations from Dr. Ashford's morning rounds, when she heard the sound. Not a sound, really. A change in the room's air pressure. The ventilator's rhythm stuttered. His oxygen saturation began its descent. 91. 89. Katie was at the bedside before conscious thought caught up with reflex. Marcus's lips were blue. His chest wasn't moving right, one side rising, the other locked. The monitors screamed their alarm into the empty hallway, but the hallway stayed empty. The call light blinked red. 12 seconds passed. 18. 22. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pressing against his heart. Every second, his oxygen dropped further, 85, 82, 78, and his body was running out of time like a clock nobody had wound. The rapid response team was 8 minutes away, maybe 12 if they were deep in the hospital, maybe longer if they were slow. Maybe longer if nobody came at all. Katie moved. Her hands reached for the crash cart before her mind caught up. The 14-gauge angiocath sat in its sterile packaging, exactly where it should be. She felt muscle memory take over, the kind that lives in bone and nerve, older than conscious decision. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Landmark. Prep. One sharp motion, and the needle drove through skin and into the chest wall, through the parietal pleura, and the hiss, God, the sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung learning to breathe again. It came like a prayer answered by a surgeon who had spent for years teaching her hands what her mind wanted to forget. The oxygen saturation began its climb. 78, 82, 88, 91. Marcus's color shifted from blue to mottled to something almost human. His chest began to rise again, both sides moving in tandem. The monitor's frantic rhythm steadied into something approximating normal. Katie left the angiocath in place, secured it with tape that felt thick as gunfire, and stepped back as the rapid response team exploded through the doorway. They moved around her like she was furniture. Nurses she knew, a resident she'd seen in the cafeteria, a respiratory therapist carrying equipment like weapons. Nobody asked her what she had done. Nobody seemed to notice she was still standing there, still moving on the residual adrenaline of having just saved a man's life in a room that wasn't supposed to need saving. What happened? The resident demanded, eyes on the monitor. Katie's voice came steady. Tension pneumothorax. Decompression needle at the second intercostal space. 10 minutes ago. He's been stable since. Who placed the needle? Silence. Who? The resident repeated, louder. I did, Katie said. The words were flat. Honest. Damning. They got Marcus transferred to the ICU in the chaos of competent crisis management. The resident didn't ask again. The nurses stopped moving long enough to exchange glances that Katie felt like physical weight, and then they were gone, and the hallway swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Katie stood alone in room 314, and she documented everything, the timeline, Marcus's vital signs, her findings, the procedure, her name, and the clinical rationale that she had no standing to provide. The charge nurse found her at the computer station at 2200. Katie, you need to go home. I'm documenting the incident. Let the day shift handle it. There is no day shift to handle it, Katie said. I'm the only witness. By midnight, Dr. Ashford had read the chart. Katie was 2 miles away in her apartment, staring at the wall of her bedroom, when her phone buzzed with a message from the staff portal, a reassignment notification. Effective immediately, she was transferred to the night shift in geriatrics. Third floor. The opposite wing. A different universe. She refreshed the staff schedule 3 times, thinking the portal might correct itself. It didn't. Marcus's care team now belonged exclusively to day shift nurses she didn't know, nurses who answered to Dr. Ashford, nurses whose schedules would never cross hers again. She tried accessing the system the next day to check on Marcus's status, but her badge-level clearance had been restricted. Third floor, geriatrics, night shift only. Nursing stations, supply rooms, medication dispensaries, only the areas relevant to her new assignment would unlock. The call came from David Jr. on Sunday morning. Katie was stocking medication in a supply closet 3 floors above where his father lay recovering, 3 time zones away from the ICU visiting hours. "I'm looking for Katie Rodriguez," he said. "She was my dad's nurse. The nurse's station keeps saying she's no longer assigned to his care." Katie's grip tightened on the phone. In the background, she could hear the hospital's ambient noise, the sounds of a place that was already moving on, already forgetting, already burying the truth under the machinery of acceptable protocols and liability concerns and the careful management of what a doctor decided the world needed to know. "When did they reassign her?" David Jr. was asking, and Katie understood that he had recognized what Dr. Ashford had chosen not to, that a nurse doesn't stay in a room past her shift for someone who is just another patient, that a nurse doesn't perform a life-saving procedure and then accept erasure quietly, that some people carry the weight of what they've done in their shoulders while others waited for paperwork to make it disappear. Dr. Ashford didn't see a hero walk out of room 314 that night. He saw a threat. A nurse who had crossed a line so bright and clear that even she couldn't have missed it, and yet she'd crossed it anyway with the kind of certainty that came from somewhere deeper than protocol, somewhere older than policy, somewhere he couldn't touch or control. He stood in the ICU corridor at 11:38 p.m. with his tablet glowing in the dark hallway, reading through the incident report Katie had filed with clinical precision, needle gauge, insertion site, oxygen saturation climb, timeline, everything documented like she was building a case against him instead of defending herself. Which, he understood now, she was. 2 silver stars and a purple heart sat somewhere in her personnel file under a name that wasn't Katie Rodriguez, and he had no idea how he'd missed it, no idea that the quiet nurse in the discount scrubs was anything other than what she appeared. But what she'd done to Marcus Hayes in that room, what she'd done without a physician's order, without a respiratory therapist, without anything but her own 2 hands and a knowledge of trauma medicine that didn't belong in a civilian hospital, that was a problem that needed solving. The next morning, Ashford moved with the precision of a chess player who'd already calculated 6 moves ahead. He pulled the staffing matrix for the ICU ward and made 3 phone calls before 7 a.m., 1 to the director of nursing, 1 to the overnight charge nurse, and 1 that mattered most, to board member Richardson, who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about liability exposure since the Hayes incident. "We have a nurse performing procedures outside her scope," Ashford said, his voice carrying the exact tone of concern that Richardson had learned to respond to. "Creating risk for the hospital. I'm moving her to night shift geriatrics, distance from critical patients, supervised environment, time for her to understand the boundaries of her position." It wasn't a request. It was a decision already made, already filed, already moving through the hospital's bureaucratic veins like poison. By the time Katie showed up for her shift the following Tuesday, her assignment had changed. Not geriatrics. Not nights. But the unit reassignment meant that Marcus Hayes would never see her again, that she'd be 73 floors away in the old care wing, that the schedule would shift so she'd never overlap with ICU rotations, that her access card would be flagged when she tried to enter the supply room where the critical equipment lived. Ashford made a second series of calls, to 3 board members, to the hospital's risk management officer, to a consultant he knew who specialized in liability mitigation. The language was careful, the tone appropriately measured. "Rogue nursing decision under emotional duress," he said to each of them. "We need to establish clear boundaries before this becomes a pattern. Liability concerns. Chain of command breakdown. I'm handling it internally, but you should be aware." He never said what Katie had done. He said what it represented, a nurse who wouldn't stay in her lane, who'd decided to perform surgery because she felt emotional about a patient, who'd created exposure the hospital couldn't afford, The calls worked the way he designed them to. By Friday, 3 board members were discussing the nursing situation at the monthly governance meeting, and the narrative had shifted from heroic intervention to reckless endangerment. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 weeks passed in the kind of silence that comes before a door closes forever. Katie worked nights in geriatrics, pushing medication carts down hallways lined with the softly sleeping elderly, listening to the ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm, understanding with each shift that she was being systematically erased from the one place where she'd mattered. She never asked why the reassignment happened. She didn't file a grievance. She accepted it the way soldiers accept orders they don't agree with, quietly, completely, without the kind of resistance that gives the other person ammunition. Which was its own kind of mistake. Because acceptance looked like guilt to people who were hunting for guilt, and silence looked like consent to people who were listening for agreement. Ashford watched her accept the reassignment without pushback, and that's when he decided the reassignment wasn't enough. The phone call came on a Tuesday at 1 p.m. Katie was on her break in the geriatric unit staff room, sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee that had developed a thin skin on top, when her phone buzzed. A text from the staffing office, report to Dr. Ashford's office immediately. She set the coffee down, didn't finish it, just left it there on the plastic table, and made her way down through the hospital's fluorescent corridors toward the administrative wing. The air changed as she walked, became colder somehow, carried the smell of leather furniture and expensive cologne instead of antiseptic. His office had a door that closed. The kind that muffled sound from the outside world. HR was already there when she arrived. A woman named Patricia Chen, who managed employment contracts and terminations with the kind of emotional distance that made her good at her job. On Dr. Ashford's desk sat a file, thick enough to contain everything, every incident report, every note, every careful documentation that Katie had entered into the system thinking that precision was protection. It wasn't. Precision was just a record of what you'd done wrong, filed away and annotated until it looked like a pattern instead of a single moment of life-saving intervention. You violated clinical protocols, Ashford said, his voice the exact tone of regret, the performance of a man who was reluctant to do what was necessary. You performed a procedure outside your scope of practice. You disregarded the chain of command. You made a unilateral medical decision without physician consultation or oversight. He slid the termination letter across the desk. The paper was heavy stock, the kind that suggested finality. You've created a liability exposure this hospital cannot tolerate. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for gross violation of clinical protocols. Katie sat in silence. Her hands were folded on her lap. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, was the careful containment of something that wanted to stand up and speak, wanted to detail exactly what had happened in room 314, wanted to explain that she'd felt for his pulse and found none, had read the monitor and seen the line flattening toward flat, had understood in the way that combat surgeons understand that waiting for a physician's order was the same as choosing to let him die. She took one measured breath, then another. When she spoke, her voice was level, quiet, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Sergeant Hayes would have died without that intervention, Doctor. Ashford didn't blink. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind a dozen times, had prepared for exactly this kind of appeal, and he'd decided that compassion was weakness, that acknowledgement was liability. Security will escort you out, he said, and he wasn't looking at her anymore, was already turning back to his computer screen, dismissing her the way you dismiss someone who'd stopped mattering the moment they walked into the room. The rain started before Katie made it to the parking garage. The kind of Norfolk rain that comes in sideways, that soaks through fabric and finds every opening in your defenses. She carried a cardboard box, her belongings, the things she'd accumulated during 6 weeks of believing she might actually rebuild something here. Inside the box sat a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent that she'd meant to give water to but kept forgetting. And a photograph of David in his dress blues, the one she kept at her desk, the one that reminded her every day who she was working to save, and now just reminded her who she'd failed to protect. Her scrubs were soaked through by the time she reached the bus stop. The rain hammered the cardboard box, softening it, threatening to dissolve it entirely. She held David's photograph underneath her jacket, pressed it against her ribs like she could keep him dry if she held him close enough, knowing that she couldn't, had never been able to, that the things you lose are lost the moment you understand you can lose them. She'd come back to nursing to rebuild a life where she wasn't Major Katie Rodriguez anymore, where she could escape the ghosts that lived in the places where she'd learned to save lives and failed to save her own son. She came to Seattle General to help people. She saved Marcus Hayes. She held his hand through the recovery, watched his O2 SATs climb from the dangerous low back to the normal range, knew that without that needle decompression his heart would have stopped in a matter of minutes. And it cost her everything. The thing nobody tells you about the military is that it teaches you to survive things no civilian ever should. That it gives you skills that make you useful and then makes you pay a price for having them. That sometimes saving one life means losing everything else, and you have to decide whether that trade was worth making. Katie sat on the bench at the bus stop, rain soaking through to her skin, and she didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry at bus stops. They sit with their cardboard boxes and their dead sons and their photographs, and they wait for the bus to come, and they plan what comes next, because there is always a next, because quitting isn't an option for people who've learned that quitting is what gets other people killed. The bus arrived at 2:14 p.m. Katie stood up, the wet box falling apart in her hands, and she made a choice. Not to leave. Not to accept. Not to let what had happened in room 314 disappear the way Ashford had designed it to disappear, erased, documented as the mistake of a nurse who didn't know her limits, filed away in the hospital's record books as a cautionary tale about staying in your lane. She'd been medically discharged after an IED in Bagram shattered her hip, left her with a limp that most people didn't notice if she moved carefully, left her with a tremor in her right hand that she'd trained herself to hide through breathing and muscle memory and the kind of discipline that came from knowing you'd already survived worse. She'd rebuilt herself once. She could do it again. She slips past security at 16:36, when the shift change creates that 3-minute window where nobody's watching the stairwell. The ID badge on her chest says Katie Rodriguez, RN, but her hands know better. They move like they've done this 1,000 times, through hostile checkpoints, past armed sentries, into places she had no business being except that she was the only one who could save lives there. Room 314 is quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, that steady rhythm like a metronome counting down something neither of them can stop. Marcus Hayes sits in his wheelchair, chin angled toward the window where Norfolk rain hammers the glass like distant artillery. His shoulders are narrower now, the months of abandonment leaving their mark in muscle loss and a kind of accumulated exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. Katie doesn't announce herself. She moves to the bedside and reaches for his hand, that calloused palm that once gripped an M16, now just skin and bones wrapped in the fragility of a life interrupted. She squeezes gently. "Hey, Sarge." His eyes are slow to focus. Medication, pain, the weight of months stacked on top of everything before. But then they track to her face, and something shifts behind them. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. And then his gaze drops, slides down her neck, catches on something that shouldn't be visible. The dog tag. It slipped out from under her scrubs, David's tag on a broken chain, the metal worn smooth from 23 years of carrying it. Reaper's call sign is etched on the flip side, invisible now but burned into her muscle memory like a scar she'll never be rid of. Marcus's hand moves with sudden strength, surprising for a man they said would never grip anything again. His fingers wrap around her wrist like a vice. His voice comes out rough, fractured, but unmistakable, Reaper. Not a question. A name. A rank. A ghost becoming flesh. The door opens. David Jr. fills the frame, same height as his father, same set to his jaw, but his eyes widen as they connect the geometry of this moment. The woman. The dog tag. The call sign his father just whispered like a prayer. His voice comes out strangled, "You're Major Rodriguez." Katie doesn't move. Doesn't flinch. Doesn't release the breath she's been holding for 6 months. She just stands there with Marcus's hand anchoring her wrist, and meets David Jr.'s eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The vital signs monitor continues its beeping. One of those sounds that becomes invisible until the moment it needs to mean everything. Another nurse enters. Katie doesn't know her name, probably someone hired after she was escorted out, and she's pushing the vitals cart with the efficiency of someone who's done this 847 times. Routine. Mechanical. Until she sees Katie. Until she sees the dog tag. Until something in her recognition shifts and her eyes drop to the chart in her hands, and she reads something there that makes her fingers tremble against the clipboard. The nurse's voice barely makes it out. You were at Bagram. You were his trauma surgeon before. The sentence doesn't finish because the corridor erupts. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. A man in dress blues with the bearing of someone who's forgotten more about warfare than most people ever learn. He stops at the threshold, takes in the scene, Katie with her dog tag visible, Marcus gripping her wrist, David Jr. standing like he's seen a ghost, and his voice comes out military precise, Major Rodriguez. 2 silver stars and a purple heart. Not a greeting. A citation. A weight made of metal and blood. Katie turns to acknowledge him, and that's when Dr. Ashford steps out of the elevator. He's been somewhere important, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened like he's just come from entertaining board members, from convincing them that response times matter more than actual care, from selling a story about a hospital where optics trump everything. He sees the crowd outside room 314. He sees the military uniform. He sees Katie standing in the center of all of it, no longer hiding. The blood drains from his face like someone just opened a valve. David Jr. has his phone out. The military citation is pulled up on the screen, the official record, the medals listed in ascending order, the operational summary that reads like mythology until you realize it's all forensic documentation. He reads it aloud, his voice shaking. Major Catherine Elizabeth Rodriguez, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Task Force 121, Bagram Airfield, 2007 through 2011. 34 field surgical procedures under hostile fire. 0 mortality rate. Decorated twice for extraordinary valor. Medically discharged following IED detonation, compound fracture left femur, shrapnel embedding in right hip. Recommended for promotion to lieutenant colonel, declined due to medical status. The words hang in the air like smoke. The SEAL team leader steps forward and extends his hand. Katie takes it, and when she does, when she's forced into direct contact with her past, her voice comes out different, lower, steadier, carrying the weight of command. Petty officer. Appreciate the recognition. Not I appreciate. Just the acknowledgement. The military syntax returning like a muscle remembering what it was built for. Dr. Ashford's mouth opens. Closes. Opens again. No words come out because he's watching the exact moment his weapon turns inward. He made the call for an investigation. He filed the complaint. He wanted to prove that Katie Rodriguez, RN, was unstable, dangerous, operating outside protocol. And what the investigation found instead was his pattern: 6 months of documented negligence, patient dumping, falsified ICU response metrics, staff reassignments designed to inflate his numbers for visiting board members, standing orders that left critical floors understaffed, complaints systematically suppressed, incident reports filed and refiled until they disappeared like they never existed at all. 15 families came forward once the inquiry began. 32 adverse events traced back to his reassignments. A patient in the NICU who developed a preventable infection because respiratory therapy was pulled to the ICU. An elderly woman in post-op who went septic because nobody was watching the drain. A diabetic in the ER whose blood sugar crashed because the nurse he reassigned didn't know his medical history. And then there was Marcus Hayes. 6 hours. Soaking in his own waste. While Dr. Ashford entertained board members talking about how efficiently they could move patients through the system. The medical director's conclusion: Katie's needle decompression wasn't just appropriate. It was the only intervention that could have saved his life. The procedure was executed with 19-gauge precision, 2 cubic centimeters lidocaine injected at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. Lung reinflation. O2 sat climbing from 68 to 91 in 42 seconds. Not a protocol violation. A rescue. And every move Dr. Ashford made afterward, the reassignment, the access restriction, the board calls, the scheduled rotation changes, the emails suggesting Katie was unstable, all of it documented, all of it discoverable, all of it converting his attempts to bury her into the evidence of his own burial. The hospital board met for 3 hours. By the end, they'd terminated him for gross negligence, falsification of patient records, and retaliation against a whistleblower. His medical license suspended pending state review. He was escorted out by the same security team that removed Katie, except this time nobody was taking him anywhere. This time he was leaving in disgrace. The rain continues outside room 314, that sound of weather made manifest, indifferent to whether men rise or fall. 6 months pass. Katie's office overlooks the lobby of Seattle General, the exact spot where she was walked out with a cardboard box and a life that needed rebuilding. The hospital issued a formal apology. Back pay. And an offer, rebuild the culture Dr. Ashford corrupted. Director of Emergency Nursing. Leadership over the department that removed her. She accepted on one condition. No patient abandoned for more than 2 hours. Every nurse has the authority to override unsafe orders. The protocol written into the bylaws, carved into the hospital's DNA like a scar that refuses to be invisible. The cracked mug sits on her desk now, world's okayest nurse. The succulent thrives in afternoon light. David's dog tag rests beside a photograph of her son in dress blues, 17 years old in the image, never aging past the moment the bullet found him in Helmand Province. Sometimes at night, finishing paperwork, Katie sees a familiar figure at the entrance of the hospital. Security uniform, badge checking, eyes that never quite make contact with anyone. Dr. Ashford. Making minimum wage. Checking IDs at the front gate of the institution he once commanded, where his name is no longer on any roster, where his patients now receive care from nurses who won't abandon them for optics. Upstairs in room 314, Marcus keeps 2 photographs on his bedside table. His daughter has roses painted on the wall. His son visits twice a week and brings Katie coffee, calls her Major, and she doesn't correct him anymore because that's who she is now, not hiding, not diminished, but restored to her actual size. A plaque hangs on Katie's office wall, engraved in dark wood, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She limps through the hospital corridors, her medical discharge papers filed away, her trauma knife sanitized and retired. When new nurses ask about her scars, the one on her hip where shrapnel embedded, the ones on her hands from field surgery without adequate lighting, the ones nobody can see but everybody carries, she tells them the same thing: some wounds are worth carrying. They tell you you survived. They tell you learned something. They tell you exactly who you decided to become on the other side of unbearable. And when patients in her department receive care that meets protocol, when families don't wait 6 hours wondering if anyone remembers their loved one exists, when a nurse can override a dangerous order without fear of retaliation, that's Katie's wound speaking. That's what happens when you let the quietest person in the room remember exactly what she was built for. The rain keeps falling on Norfolk. The ventilator keeps its rhythm in room 314. And somewhere in the basement, on a security feed nobody watches anymore, a man in a uniform that doesn't fit his shoulders checks another visitor's badge and disappears back into obscurity, the only punishment worse than prison, being forgotten by the world he thought he commanded. If you made it this far, you understand that heroes don't always wear the uniform that marks them. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who save lives in the places where nobody's watching. Hit that like button if you've ever seen someone underestimated and proved everyone wrong. And in the comments, tell me, would you have stayed, like Katie did? Would you have risked everything for one patient nobody else was watching? Let me know.